My name is Jack Monroe, 60 years old, a fisherman who spent his whole life on the cold waters off Maine. Every winter, I went out in the storms. Every summer, I breathed the salt of the ocean instead of the scent of roses. I once thought my life, hard as it was, still had meaning because I had a home to return to, a gentle wife, and a son I could be proud of. But that night in Portland, inside my son's two-bedroom apartment, I learned the harshest truth. All those sacrifices meant nothing anymore. That evening, the air was cold, the wind from Casco Bay rattling the window panes. I cooked clam chowder, the New England soup Linda, my wife, always made for holidays. I had never really learned how to cook, but that dish I remembered step by step, flavor by flavor, as if holding on to a piece of Linda's memory in that small kitchen. I carried it to the table and ladled bowls for David and Melissa. A part of me hoped the taste would draw us closer again. Melissa stirred her spoon gently. She never looked at me, her eyes glued to the phone resting on her lap. David sat across from me, cracked open a Bud Light, took a sip, and said nothing. I forced a smile and asked the question I always asked. How was your day? No answer came right away, only the sound of metal against the bowl and the soft pop of the beer can. I drew a long breath, swallowed the awkward silence, and lifted a spoonful for myself. The chowder rose fragrant, yet the taste seemed lost in that room filled with silence. Then Melissa set her spoon down. The sharp clang of metal against porcelain cut straight into my chest. She lifted her head, eyes locked on me. No hesitation. We can't keep feeding an extra mouth. For a moment, I thought I had heard wrong. I blinked, waited for a crooked smile, waited for David to wave it off. But he only lifted his face toward his wife, gave the smallest nod, as if what she had said was plain truth. I went still. The rush of blood in my ears was louder than the furnace fan. Extra mouth, a useless mouth to feed. After 60 years at sea, after thousands of sleepless nights hauling in fish, after sweating through every tuition bill I ever paid for my son, now I was nothing more than a burden under his roof. I turned to David, searching for a spark of protest. For the words, "Dad," she didn't mean it. But my son never opened his mouth. His silence cut deeper than Melissa's words. My hand trembled as I set the spoon down. I tried to keep my voice calm, though my throat was dry and raw. Do you really think that way? David never looked at me. He took another pull from the beer, exhaled. Melissa folded her arms, leaned back in her chair, and her eyes filled with annoyance. I understood then. No more words were needed. I rose to my feet and walked slowly to the small room where I had been staying. There was nothing in it but a single bed and an old wardrobe. I pulled out two worn canvas bags, stuffed in a few clothes, my heavy coat, and one old photograph of Linda. There was not much else to take. As I zipped by the bag, my chest tightened. I did not cry. A man of 60 who had fought through snowstorms at sea, who had faced death more than once, now shook at the threshold of his own son's home. I carried the bags back out. David and Melissa still sat at the table. They never stood, never spoke. I opened the door. Cold air rushed in, carrying the faraway scent of salt water. I stepped into the hall and pulled the door closed behind me. The sound echoed like a verdict. Outside, Portland's streets lay empty. The street lights glowed pale yellow across the wet pavement. I sat on the steps, set my bags down, and pulled my coat tight. The wind cut across my face, stinging my eyes. I looked up. The apartment window still glowed with light, but no one stood there. No farewell glance, no blessing, no final embrace. I stayed there for a long time, invisible. In my head, one question kept repeating. Is this how it ends after everything? I once imagined growing old on a porch, drinking coffee, hearing my son laugh in the living room, and watching grandchildren run in the yard. That dream was shattered in a single sentence and a single nod. That night, the Maine wind bit hard, but the cold inside me was worse. I stood, lifted my bags, and walked down the street. I did not know where I was going or what the future held. I only knew that a lifetime of sacrifice had been buried in two words: extra mouth. Before I turned down the road toward the bus station, I looked back once. The apartment still shone with its soft yellow light, the place I once thought would be my final shelter. In that moment, I understood. I had lost everything, not at sea, not in the storms, but inside the very home of my own son. I took one last look and realized that after a lifetime of giving, I had become the leftover in my own family. If you have ever seen parents treated with contempt just because of age or circumstance, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. This story is not only mine, it is the truth so many have endured. I was born and raised in a small coastal town in Maine where the waves crashed against the shore day and night, and the smell of fish always lingered in the wind. My father was a fisherman, and he often said, "The sea is the first wife of every man here." I did not fully understand when I was a boy, but at 15, the first time I went out with him, I knew he was right. The sea never spares anyone. It can embrace you, but it can also drag you under at any moment. Back then, we sailed in a small wooden boat with an old motor, just strong enough to push through steady waves. I remember the first storm that struck without warning, the wind howling, waves rising like black walls in front of us. I thought I would die when water poured into the hold, my body shaking inside the soaked raincoat. My father stayed calm at the wheel and shouted through the gale, "Hold the nets! Don't let them go!" I obeyed, my hands numb, my eyes blurred with salt water. When we finally made it back to port, I collapsed on the deck, vomiting, my body frozen past feeling. My father only patted my shoulder and gave a rough smile. Now you know, living off the sea means walking the edge between life and death. The years after that, the sea taught me more lessons. Some seasons, we were lucky, bringing home holds filled with lobster, haddock, and cod. In other seasons, the boat was empty, with only a few fish to make soup. I grew used to the smell of diesel, the stench of fish that clung to my hands, the mornings that began before sunrise, and the nights so late the docks were dark when we returned. Then I met Linda at a church gathering. She was unlike the other coastal girls, her blonde hair tied neatly, her smile gentle, but her eyes fierce. Linda worked at the small bakery in town. I remember the first time I brought her a fish fresh from the sea, and she laughed softly. "Are you trying to win me over with the smell of fish?" I flushed, awkward, but she did not turn me away. We married in a simple ceremony with guests mostly family and fishing friends. I had little money, but Linda never asked for more. We rented a small wooden house near the harbor. Each morning she baked while I sailed. At night I often traded fish for flour, sugar, and milk, the things she needed for the bakery. When David was born, I looked at the tiny red child in Linda's arms and swore I would give him a better life than mine. I did not want him to face storms at sea, the biting winter winds, the danger that never left. I wanted my son to study, to go further than the main shoreline. So I worked harder. I sailed on longer trips, weeks away from home. Once, a snowstorm struck without warning, nearly burying the boat in ice. 3 other fishermen and I spent the whole night hacking at the ice so we would not be trapped. I came home with hands cracked and bleeding from the salt, but all I thought was, as long as David goes to school, it is worth it. When David turned 18, the acceptance letter came from the University of Maine. That night, Linda cried with joy. I sat silent, staring at the paper, thinking of the tuition. To pay for it, I sold the first boat, the one tied to my father in my youth. I stood there watching them tow it away, feeling as if a piece of my body had been cut off. But I told myself, this is the price of the future. David studied well, seldom came home, but whenever he did, he told us about things we never knew, about technology, finance, and the bustling cities. I felt pride, even if I could not understand it all. I always thought, as long as my son rises higher, the calluses on my hands are worth it. After David graduated, he wanted to buy a small apartment in Portland. I knew he could not afford the down payment, so I sold some land my father had left me. When I signed the check and handed it to him, Linda looked at me with worry, but I said, "He needs a start. This is his home." Linda was my anchor through every storm. Then came the day she was diagnosed with cancer. I took her to Boston for treatments and sold another boat to cover hospital bills. I watched her grow thin, her hair fall away, yet she always tried to smile when I entered the room. On her last night, she held my hand and whispered, "Jack, don't let anyone take away your worth." Then she slipped away, leaving a hollow no one could fill. After the funeral, I went back to the small wooden house, so empty that every crash of the waves outside cut into me like a blade. All I had left was David. I thought, at least I still have my son. I believed after all I had given, he would never turn his back. I believed a father's bond was the strongest bond there could ever be. I never imagined the day would come when a father's love would be seen as a burden. After Linda passed, the small wooden house by the shore grew unbearably empty. Every morning when I woke, I still turned my head toward her side of the bed, hoping to hear her soft cough or the scent of fresh coffee drifting from the kitchen. But there was only silence, heavy as dust covering everything. I tried to live there for a few more months, but the loneliness pressed on my chest like stone. The long days stretched endlessly. The sea was no longer a place to find meaning, but a mirror reflecting my own emptiness. David told me, "Dad, move to Portland for a while. My apartment has a spare room. You won't feel so alone there." His words lifted me a little. I thought, at least he still remembered me. So I packed a few bags, our wedding photo, my sea-worn coat, and locked the house filled with memories. I told myself that living with my son would bring a little warmth back. But the moment I stepped into David and Melissa's apartment, I realized my presence was not as welcome as I had believed. The room they gave me was a small storage space at the end of the hall, a single bed hastily pushed in, a rickety wooden dresser, and a tiny window facing the parking lot. I did not complain. An old man like me did not need much, only a corner to rest. I cleaned it up, arranged it neatly, telling myself I would soon blend into their rhythm of life. But Melissa hardly hid her displeasure. In the very first week, I was watching a baseball game on ESPN when she came into the living room, grabbed the remote without a word, and switched to a reality show. I was surprised but tried to smile, gently saying, "The game is in the final inning." Melissa only shrugged, waved her hand. "Old man, I can't stand the shouting anymore." That phrase, "old man," struck me like a stone. On the docks, my friends called one another that with laughter. But from the mouth of my daughter-in-law, it sliced straight across my pride. David was sitting on the sofa with his laptop. He glanced up and said briefly, "She's stressed. Let it go, Dad." I stayed quiet. A man who spent his life at sea learns to swallow things down. But coldness repeated day after day was like relentless waves, not strong enough to drown me at once, but enough to wear away my patience piece by piece. Once I asked Melissa, "What would you like for dinner if I cook?" She sighed, eyes fixed on her phone. "Don't bother, I already ordered out." The family table I had imagined would bind us together became nothing more than each of us in our own corner. The clatter of keys, the TV noise, and my own isolation. I still tried to contribute. I cleaned the house, did the shopping, and folded laundry, hoping Melissa would see I was not a burden. But all I received was the look of irritation whenever I crossed the living room or her frown when I made too much noise washing dishes. One evening, I walked down the hall toward my room and caught voices from behind their bedroom door. Melissa's tone was sharp. "Your dad is dead weight. I can't take it anymore." Dead weight. The words landed like a fist to my gut. I held my breath, praying not to make a sound. David did not answer at once. I heard footsteps shift, then his low, hesitant voice. "I know. She's stressed. I'll talk to him." I stepped back, slipped quietly into my room, and closed the door. In the dark, I sat on the bed, my head in my hands. I had once carried this family through countless, brutal seasons, sold the very boats that defined my life so my son could study. Yet now I was dead weight to my daughter-in-law, and my son did not deny it. He only excused her. Day after day, the feeling of being pushed aside repeated. I walked past the living room, and Melissa avoided my eyes. David glued his eyes to the screen, pretending not to see me. I asked a polite question and got nothing but a distracted nod. I brought fresh fish home from the market, placed it on the table, and they ate quickly without even a thank you. Some nights I shut my door, sat alone, staring at Linda's picture on the nightstand. I whispered, "Do you see this, love? I am fading inside my own family." That coldness was like an invisible net tightening around me. Not a single hard blow that would push me to fight back, but tiny cuts repeated until I had nothing left. I knew the conflict was building toward a breaking point, but I did not expect it to explode so suddenly. And then one evening at dinner, what I feared most finally came true. But that is another story, a story that changed my life forever. What do you think when a son stays silent on the side of an outsider instead of his own parent? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I left David and Melissa's apartment on a night so cold it cut through the skin. Portland was no shining city. It was a place where the ocean wind whipped through every street and the salt seeped into the bricks of old walls. I dragged 2 canvas bags along the sidewalk, sat for a while at the bus stop, then finally stepped into a roadside motel. The neon sign above the office flickered weakly, the word vacancy sputtering like it was out of breath. The manager handed me a key without looking up from the small screen in front of him. I opened the door to room 204 and was hit by the stench of old cigarettes. The curtains were torn, one hook dangling loose, the carpet stained with patches I could not tell were coffee or dry blood. The mattress sagged as if it had carried hundreds of heavy dreams before me. I sat down, heard the springs groan, and thought, this is the wild place I can still call home. That night, I could not sleep. I stared at the stained ceiling, listened to the trucks rumbling past, shaking the window. In the darkness, Linda's last words rose in my mind, clear as yesterday. Don't let anyone take your worth away. I had promised her, yet only months later, I let my own son strip away my worth as if it never existed. I asked myself if I had failed even at keeping her final wish. I sat up and opened the cardboard box I had brought from the house by the sea. Inside were scattered papers, David's birth certificate, our marriage license, a few family photos, and Linda's old insurance booklet. I turned each one with trembling hands, my heart a storm. Then at the bottom I found a thick envelope, yellowed, edges frayed. In faded handwriting it read, "For Jack, from Uncle Thomas." I froze. Thomas Monroe, the uncle I rarely spoke of. He had served in World War II, came back limping on one leg with eyes that always seemed far away. I remembered seeing him a few times as a boy. Then he lived quietly in another town, hardly reaching out. I had no idea why his envelope was in my box. I opened it. Inside was a neat stack of papers, and in the middle, a handwritten letter, a trust certificate in the name of Thomas Monroe, with one note clear as day. Beneficiary, Jack L. Monroe. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. I grabbed the letter, unfolded it. The handwriting shook but was steady enough to read. Jack, if you are reading this, I am gone. I was never good at showing it, but I always watched you. I know you followed your father to the sea, carrying too much on your back. I never had children, so what I saved, my veteran's pension, the bonds, and the few shares I bought back in the 60s, I leave to you. Not much compared to the wealthy men out there, but enough so you will no longer bleed your body and soul just to survive. Use it to live, not just exist. Never forget, you have worth. I read it again and again, my eyes blurred, not from age, but from tears rising. I turned the rest of the papers. Asset statements, investment certificates, and bank confirmations. The total, if I counted right, could reach over $2 million. A number of fishermen like me had never dared to dream. In that motel room that smelled of smoke and damp, for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. I clutched the letter tight, as if Thomas from the other side was laying a hand on my shoulder saying, you still have a chance. I leaned back on the sagging bed, laid the letter on my chest, and stared at the ceiling. Outside, the wind still screamed against the glass, but inside me, there was a rare warmth. Not the warmth of family that David and Melissa had stripped away, but the warmth of recognition. Someone believed I had worth. Someone wanted me to live on, not as an extra mouth, but as a man with the right to hold his head high. That night, I did not sleep, but for the first time in many months, I did not feel invisible. I knew life had just opened a door for me, and this time I swore I would walk through it, never bowing to anyone again. I carefully folded Uncle Thomas's letter, slipped it back into the envelope, and placed it on the wobbly table in the motel room. My head spun with questions. What was I supposed to do with this money? I was a fisherman, a man who spent his whole life hauling nets, mending ropes, braving storms. Could I really become someone who managed an investment trust? The next morning, I went to the only name listed in the papers, James Harris, the attorney who had overseen Thomas's estate. His office sat inside an old red brick building near the abandoned docks of Portland. The moment I stepped in, the scent of paper and polished wood filled the air, overwhelming me. Harris was a man of about 70, his hair white but his movements sharp. He looked at me over gold-rimmed glasses, then gave me a warm smile. Jack Monroe. I've been waiting for this day a long time. I fumbled as I held out the envelope. Uncle Thomas, he left me. I know, Harris said firmly, nodding. Thomas believed you would know how to use it. He had no one else, and he prepared all the paperwork to make sure the transfer would be smooth. We sat at his desk. Harris opened the files and pointed out each section. Bank accounts, bonds, old stocks, a small piece of real estate already sold, altogether worth over $2 million. I stared at the numbers printed in ink, feeling as though I was dreaming. I once fought all month for a few $1,000s, and now this sum appeared before me like an endless ocean. I I don't know anything about this, I admitted, my hands shaking. Harris studied me with patient eyes. You don't need to know everything right away. What you need is to learn how to stand tall. Money cannot change the past, but it can change the rest of your life. Let me guide you. I walked out that day with a small notebook Harris gave me. A list of books to read, free finance classes at the Portland Library, and even some YouTube channels, he said, the young people use to learn real estate. I clutched that notebook like a compass for the life ahead. I began to change. In the mornings, instead of heading to the docks, I walked to the Portland Public Library. I sat at a reading table, opening thick books on personal finance, real estate, and retirement funds. At first, the words looked like a foreign language. Dividend yield, capital gain, equity. I had to look up each term, jot down notes in the margins. Some nights I stayed until the library closed, my neck stiff and aching, but my mind burning bright. At night, I opened my old laptop, watching YouTube tutorials. Young men with slicked hair talked about distressed sales, forming LLCs, and negotiating contracts. I paused, rewound, and took notes line by line. In that shabby motel room, the blue glow of the screen shone on my wrinkled face, and I felt like a high school kid starting over. Sometimes I joined small local meetups for entrepreneurs. At first, I was awkward, my worn clothes setting me apart from the young men in blazers holding iPads. But no one mocked me. Many even nodded when I spoke about life as a fisherman, about selling my boats to send my son to school. One man said, "You already made the biggest investment. You invested in family." His words blurred my vision with tears. It wasn't just knowledge. I was changing as a man. I went to the barber, asked for a neat cut for the first time in years, no longer letting my hair grow wild like the men on the docks. I wore an old shirt, freshly ironed. Standing in front of the motel mirror, I looked into my own eyes. The man in the glass was no longer only Jack Monroe, the worn-out fisherman. He was a new version of me, learning to take command of his fate. I began writing a plan. Harris helped me open a dedicated account for the trust. I learned to split it. Part in safe bonds, part shifted to stocks, and a portion reserved for real estate. Each time I signed a paper, my hands shook, not from fear, but from excitement. One afternoon in the library, I thought of Linda. I imagined her sitting across from me, smiling as I scribbled down numbers, her voice gentle but steady. I told you, you have worth. You only need to believe it. That image gave me strength every time I wanted to quit. One Sunday afternoon, I ran into David and Melissa on the street. They were at the farmer's market, bags of apples and vegetables in their hands. They walked right past me without noticing. I was in a clean blue shirt, hair trimmed, posture upright, nothing like the shabby old man they once dismissed. I stopped watching them. My heart ached, but I knew the truth. They no longer had the power to define me. I was not dead weight, not an extra mouth. I was Jack Monroe, and I was rising again. Time passed, and I gained more knowledge. I started speaking with real estate agents, learning the Portland market, and exploring old apartment buildings falling apart. I studied rental contracts, calculated cash flow. Each day, I filled my notebook with new lessons, mistakes to avoid. Some nights, I sat in my room, sipping cheap coffee from the convenience store, yet feeling a warmth inside. I no longer felt adrift. I had a plan, a purpose. I had come a long way from that freezing night when I was cast out, and I knew my journey was only beginning. One evening after finishing a real estate book, I closed it and smiled to myself. I whispered, I'm 60 years old, but it is never too late to begin. Linda's words blended with the wind outside the coast. Don't let anyone take your worth away. I nodded. For the first time in years, I felt I was not just surviving, I was truly living. If you ever believe that after 60 it is too late to start over, hit like on this video to show the world it is never too late. I had spent months buried in numbers, in the thick pages of books, in long hours at the library, and endless nights staring at YouTube tutorials. I told myself I was not learning to seek revenge, but to survive, to rise after being cast out of my own son's home. Yet life often throws unexpected chances, and sometimes they look exactly like fate itself. One September morning at the Portland Library, I opened the real estate auction site Harris had mentioned. I scrolled through the listings. Old warehouses, a few lots on the outskirts, some rundown buildings. Then my eyes froze. My heart pounded so hard, I had to press a hand to my chest. On the screen, the words stood out. Property auction, East Portland, apartment complex, 24 units. I recognized it immediately. It was the very building where David and Melissa lived. I read it again and again, making sure I was not mistaken. The owner had fallen behind on taxes and could no longer maintain it, so the city was putting it up for auction. The attached photo showed the gray three-story brick building, the long hallways, and the familiar windows. I could picture exactly the window of David's unit, the same view I had once looked out from when I stayed there. I sat frozen, eyes locked on the screen. Voices surged inside my head. This is the chance, this is the reckoning. This is the way to reclaim what was stripped from you. But alongside came the fear. Was I acting out of hate? Was I capable of managing an entire building? I picked up the phone and called Harris. After hearing me out, he stayed silent for a moment, then said slowly, Jack, if you do this, you must know it will change everything. This is not just an investment. This is personal. I know, I answered hoarsely, but I've been dismissed my whole life, Harris. I've let others decide my worth for too long. If I buy this building, it won't only be for revenge. It will be to prove I am not a burden. I am the one in control. He sighed but finally nodded. All right, then we'll do this carefully. You'll need an LLC to shield your name. I'll handle the filings. The following week, I threw myself into preparation. Harris set up Monroe Holdings LLC, a fully legitimate shell company. Every document was filed through the system, my name hidden from public record. I transferred part of Uncle Thomas's trust into the company account, enough to place the bid. The waiting days nearly kept me awake at night. I wandered the docks, staring at the old boats drifting aimlessly, my heart tangled. I thought of Linda. I thought of her words. Don't let anyone take your worth away. I imagined her hand on my shoulder whispering, it's time. The auction was held in a small downtown hall. I wore a second-hand blazer from Goodwill, my shirt pressed crisp. Around me sat seasoned investors talking loudly about cash flow and returns. I sat quietly, my hands clasped tight, my heart beat thunderous. When the auctioneer announced, next property, East Portland apartment complex, 24 units, the room stirred alive. Paddles went up, and the numbers climbed fast. I swallowed hard, waited for Harris's subtle nod, then raised mine. I didn't look around. I only focused on the figures. 200,000, 400, 800, 1 million. My pulse hammered as if it would burst from my chest. Finally, when the last bidder lowered his paddle, the auctioneer's voice rang out. Sold. To Monroe Holdings, LLC. I sat still, sweat dripping down my brow, palms soaked. I had just done the unthinkable. I was now the owner of the building where my son lived. A week later, Harris slid a certificate of ownership across the desk to me. I looked down at the black print. Monroe Holdings, LLC. Owner. I gripped the paper, my hand trembling. In that instant, my life turned on its axis. I remembered that freezing night on the curb with 2 bags at my side, branded in extra mouth. Now I owned the roof over their heads. I whispered, now I own their roof. The words were soft, only for me, but they rang louder than any shout. In the days that followed, I walked past the building like a stranger. I stood across the street, gazing at the lit windows. Somewhere inside, David and Melissa lived on, unaware. They thought I was still drifting between cheap motels. They didn't know the game had changed. I began working with the property management firm Harris recommended. They spoke of upgrading the building, renegotiating leases, and improving the plumbing and wiring. I nodded along. But inside, I knew there was one apartment I cared about more than all the others. I was in no rush. Everything would be legal, quiet, by the book. I didn't need noise or fights. I had learned that real power rests in silence and in signatures on the right papers. That night, back in my motel room, I sat on the bed with the ownership certificate still in my hand. I stared at it, my mind in a storm. I was no longer just a fisherman, no longer the castaway. I was the owner of a building. I was a man with a voice. And for the first time in a long while, I smiled. Not the smile of triumph, but the smile of a man who knew that he had entered a new chapter. I closed my eyes, letting the ocean wind rattle the window, and whispered, "Linda, do you see? I did not let them take my worth. I took it back." The first notice went out on a Monday morning when the autumn winds had begun sweeping through Portland. A white sheet bearing the seal of Monroe Holdings LLC was taped to every door, every mailbox. The message was simple. Starting next month, all lease agreements will be adjusted to the new market rate, rent tripled, and all previous maintenance fees recalculated. I knew the moment David read it, he would lose his mind. That evening, I sat in my small, rented apartment downtown, sipping tea. My phone buzzed nonstop. The property management company forwarded me copies of angry emails from a familiar address, david.harmon@email. Is this some kind of joke? Triple the rent. What kind of stupid and unethical landlord would do this? I demand to meet the person behind this fake LLC. I read without replying, just smiled quietly. Melissa was more frantic, her email softer, pleading. There must be some mistake. We've always been good tenants, never late on rent. Please reconsider. But I wasn't mistaken, and there was nothing to reconsider. This was the lesson. News spread quickly through the building. Tenants whispered, some angry, some confused. The management company decided to hold a mandatory meeting to explain the changes and allow questions directly to the owner. I knew David and Melissa would be there, and I knew this was the moment. That evening, I chose a simple gray blazer, a neatly pressed white shirt, and old leather shoes polished to a shine. I looked in the mirror. No longer the ragged old fisherman who had been pushed out the door. The man in the glass was an owner, a man standing tall. When I entered the community room on the ground floor, rows of plastic chairs were already filled. Faces turned, worried, angry, curious. I walked calmly to the back row, sat as if I were just another tenant. No one recognized me. Moments later, David and Melissa walked in. David was in a wrinkled shirt, tie loose, face twisted with rage. Melissa followed, her eyes red, perhaps from tears. They sat in the front row, whispering to each other. I saw David clench his fist, his knuckles white. The property manager opened the meeting, his voice steady. We're here to discuss the changes to the lease agreements. The new owner has requested adjustments to align with market costs and maintenance. The room stirred with murmurs. A few tenants voiced concern but kept calm. Then David shot to his feet, his chair clattering backward. Market value, this is robbery. I want to know who's hiding behind Monroe Holdings. They can't stay faceless forever. Eyes turned to the manager. He nodded slightly and said slowly, the true owner is here tonight. They wished to say a few words. The room fell silent. I rose and walked forward. Each step echoed against the tile like a drumbeat. When I stopped, I looked straight at David. His face shifted from fury to shock, then to stillness. I drew a breath and said, Good evening. My name is Jack Monroe. I am the owner of this building. The room erupted. Whispers, gasps. Melissa's mouth dropped open, her hand trembling against her chair. David's face burned red, his eyes wide with disbelief. This is a joke, David stammered. Dad, you can't. No joke, I answered calmly. Papers are signed. The deed is in my name. This isn't revenge. It's just business. But respect is not optional. The whispers grew louder. A man in the middle row shook his head and whistled softly. I saw David tremble, not from the cold, but from humiliation. The manager continued with plans for renovations, electrical upgrades, fresh paint, security cameras. Many tenants nodded, some agreeing the improvements were necessary even with higher rent. But David couldn't stay seated. He leapt up again, pointing at me. He's abusing power. He's deliberately destroying our lives. Can't you see it? I looked him in the eye, my voice firm and deep. David, I treat every tenant the same. Everyone pays the new rate, not just you. The only difference is that once you called me an extra mouth. The room went silent. Melissa dropped her gaze, her hand covering her mouth. A young woman whispered to her friend, extra mouth. My God. David's voice cracked with anger. You have no right. You're just a useless old man. I stepped closer, holding his eyes. No, I'm the man who gave you a home when you had nothing. I am the man who sold my boat to pay your tuition. And now I'm the man who owns this building. I am not begging. I am not pleading. I ask for only one thing, respect. The murmurs swelled again. A few tenants clapped softly. David's face drained of color. The meeting stretched another hour. I answered questions from the other residents, steady and clear. I explained the upgrades, promised safety and better living conditions. When they realized I wasn't a greedy tyrant, many nodded in agreement. David sat frozen, his face dark and twisted. Melissa trembled beside him, tears sliding down her cheeks. By the end, some tenants shook my hand saying, glad to finally meet the real owner. Another chuckled, you shut him up good. David stood in a corner, fists clenched, eyes bloodshot. As I walked out, he rushed at me, his voice dripping with bitterness. You think you've won. This is just money. You made me a laughingstock. No, David, I said calmly. You made yourself a laughingstock the night you nodded when Melissa called your father an extra mouth. I don't need to win. I only need fairness. Melissa broke into sobs and turned away. David froze as if the ground had split beneath him. That night, I returned to my small apartment. I sat alone by the window, the city lights reflecting in my tea. I thought of Linda. I thought of the long road from that humiliating dinner to this night. I did not feel the triumph I imagined. Instead, I felt release. The truth was out. There was nothing left to hide. I whispered, this isn't revenge. It's just balance. Inside me, one door closed, but another opened for freedom, for a future I could call mine. If you feel satisfaction when the truth is revealed, share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. After the tenant meeting, everything shifted quickly. From standing tall, David and Melissa plummeted straight down. The tripled rent became a weight they could not bear. Within 2 months, they were forced to sell their white gold wedding rings, the ones they had once shown off proudly to friends. Melissa slid her ring from her finger and placed it on the pawnshop counter, her eyes wet with tears. David said nothing, only clenched his jaw beside her. Melissa began taking extra shifts at the hospital, working until midnight. Her lab coat carried the smell of disinfectant and sweat as she came home with hollow eyes. David picked up side work bussing tables at a waterfront bar, the very kind of job he had once mocked middle-aged men for doing to scrape by. But the effort was never enough. They cut every expense from dinners out to cable television. The fridge grew empty. The dining table that once held bottles of wine now had only instant noodles and cans. Rumors spread fast. Friends who had once come to their parties now whispered behind their backs. Jack Monroe's son, they said. Turns out he only ever leaned on his father. Each murmur carved deeper into David's fragile pride. Neighbors eyed them with pity, some shaking their heads when they saw him stumbling home drunk. The pressure mounted. One night, Melissa packed a few bags, stood at the door with tears streaming down her face. I can't take this anymore, David. I'm going to stay with my mother. You figure yourself out. The door closed, leaving David alone in the cold apartment. In the nights that followed, the sound of bottles popping open echoed steadily. He drowned in liquor, trying to numb the shame. Each morning he dragged his weary body out, red eyes, hair disheveled. No trace left of the confident man who had once sat across from me at that fateful dinner. His reputation at work collapsed too. Managers caught him late again and again, his reports riddled with mistakes, and clients were complaining. At last, David was suspended. The career path, once built on the money I earned by selling my boat, now lay in ruins. And me, I never needed to say a word. I simply stood back and watched. No gloating, no bitterness, only the bare truth revealed. When a man loses respect for his family, life itself will teach him the price. I remembered Linda's words, "Don't let anyone take your worth away." She was right. I didn't need to fight with hate. I only needed to hold on to my worth and let time deliver the answer. A year after the tenant meeting that stripped David of his pride, I made the most important decision of my life. I sold the building to another investor. My bank account swelled with numbers I had never imagined, but I knew I did not need to keep it all for myself. In the plain white envelope Harris laid before me, I signed the papers donating part of the money to create the Monroe Scholarship Fund for poor young men in Maine who dreamed of making their living at sea. I knew their lives well, children of the docks, raised beside the waves yet trapped by poverty, with no money for a decent raincoat or tuition for trade school. I saw my own reflection at 15, shivering on the deck with my father in a snowstorm, only because we could not afford warm clothes. This time I wanted those boys to have a safer way to the ocean, a ticket out of the cycle of hunger and hardship. When the paperwork was finished, I returned to what truly gave my heart peace. I found a small cabin, old but cozy, perched near the Portland shore. It had only one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a porch facing the endless ocean. I set a wooden table I built myself, a few iron chairs with the paint peeling, and a stone fireplace. Not fancy, but every corner breathed freedom. Each morning I pulled on my faded green raincoat and carried my fishing rod to the rocks. I sat for hours listening to waves crash, the salt filling my lungs, sometimes reeling in a cod, just enough for lunch. In the afternoons, I patched nets for the younger fishermen, taught them how to tie knots, and read the wind. Neighbors came by to fix a stuck window or carry a few planks. I helped without asking for anything but a handshake and a smile. I realized I no longer needed the noise of the city, the forced dinners, or the looks of disdain. I had found myself again, the man of the sea, simple, quiet, but free. One evening the sunset painted my cabin red. I sat on the wooden chair, steam rising from a cup of tea on the table, looking out the window. On the wall hung my old fishing raincoat, worn and torn, but still sturdy, a witness to a lifetime of sacrifice. I stared at it for a long while, then smiled softly. Inside me, a sentence rose as clear as breath itself. They tried to erase me, but I am still here, stronger, freer. I never needed loud revenge, never needed to scream to prove I was right. All I needed was the final justice, the justice I gave myself by living on and leaving something behind for the next generation. Offshore, the waves rolled steadily. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled. I closed my eyes and felt the peace I had chased all my life through storms. At last, I knew my journey had ended here, not in bitterness, but in calm. There are wounds that do not need shouting to be heard. The silence of a father cast out by his own son sometimes echoes louder than 1,000 accusations. I lived in that silence. Let it drown me in motel nights. Let it teach me the bitter truth that family can cut the deepest. But that same silence gave me the strength to rise. I did not choose arguments. I did not choose to cling. I chose to walk forward, to hold the worth my wife told me to protect. And in walking forward, I discovered a truth many forget. Your worth does not depend on anyone's eyes, not even your children's. Some told me, "Jack, you were lucky to have an inheritance." Maybe so, but money did not change me. What truly changed me was the moment I stood before the mirror, neat in my old shirt, and said to myself, "You can still begin again. Life after 60 is not a sentence, it can be a new beginning." I saw myself go from a fisherman bound to storms to a man who could manage, invest, and stand tall. I saw myself move from being called an extra mouth to being respected in a room full of people. And most of all, I saw myself find peace by living true to who I was. If you hear my story and see yourself in it, whether as a father, a mother, or simply someone once cast aside, remember this: silence is not weakness. Silence, when joined with the right action, can be the strongest answer of all. I did not take revenge with shouts. I proved it by living, by standing strong, by being free. And you can too. Where are you watching this story from? Leave a comment and let me know. And if you believe fairness and resilience deserve to be heard, share this video with someone who needs it. Don't forget to subscribe for more true stories like this one.